You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is Joel Warner, whose work has appeared in publications like Esquire, Wired, Newsweek, Men's Journal, Bloomberg Businessweek, Popular Science, and Slate. He is the managing editor of the investigative news outlet The Lever and co-authored the book The Humor Code. Joel's latest book, The Curse of the Marquis de Sade, is the true story of how the Marquis de Sade's book, 120 Days of Sodom, which has been described as both one of the most important novels ever written and the gospel of evil, landed at the heart of one of the biggest scams in modern literary history. Please allow me to introduce Joel Warner, author of The Curse of the Marquis de Sade. Hello, Joel. Thank you very much for speaking with me today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I am a full-time journalist, and I've been one for quite some time, written for newspapers and magazines and written a couple books, and always looking for fascinating stories.
Fabulous. Do you have a connection to Paris or to France?
Up until this book, not much more of a connection than the other people who just find the country, the capital city, everything about the location just utterly fascinating. I'd visited France multiple times. And just is one of those places that, as you know, is just kind of captures your heart. And so you try to find any and every way that you can get back to it, which is thankfully what I was able to do.
Yeah, I think writing a book is a good excuse to come back and visit. So very clever. So speaking of which, can you tell us a little bit about this book, about The Curse of the Marquis de Sade? What is it about?
Sure. This book is about, it actually has 3 different storylines. The central storyline is this notorious manuscript, considered by many to be the most horrible thing ever written by the Marquis de Sade, who was this French aristocrat who basically inspired the term sadism because he was so obsessed with actions and his writings all about deriving pleasure from pain. And so he wrote like his most notorious manuscript, his worst manuscript he wrote while imprisoned in the Bastille. And it ended up on this centuries-spanning kind of journey. And that's what my book is about, this real kind of this journey of the scroll, until it finally returned to France in 2014, where it seemed like it had finally found its resting place. And then a few months after, it emerged that it had landed in the heart of the largest alleged Ponzi scheme in French history, run by the so-called Bernie Madoff of France. So there you go.
It's crazy. I actually went to that exhibit when it was here. And that's what actually piqued my interest in the book. Yeah, I had no idea about the controversy afterwards. And actually, I didn't know much about the history beforehand. I just knew here's an opportunity to see this scroll in person. And so I thought, okay, that's unusual. I'll go check it out. And I did. It was an interesting exhibit. But then I feel like it faded away and then I never heard anything else. So I was very curious to read your book.
If I can ask you, what was the exhibit like? Because that was one of the things that I wasn't able to actually see, the one and only public French exhibit of this notorious manuscript so far, because I started working on the story after everything had fallen apart. What was it like?
It was really interesting. It was, I think they were trying to lean into the salaciousness of the whole thing. So a lot of the walls were painted red. There were these lustful quotes on the walls from different sources. And then, if I remember correctly, I think you described this in your book too. There's like one long case with the whole scroll in the center unraveled so you could take a look at it, encased in glass and everything. It was interesting. felt like it was trying to be a little bit more provocative and sexy than I think the original source material is. If I remember correctly, I feel like there were other original pieces of text from other sources as well.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating object. Both its physical characteristics, it's this 40-foot long, 4-inch wide scroll, and just all the people whose lives it touched as it kind of moved across Europe and across the centuries.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I don't think I want to read.
You don't want to.
I think I'm happy reading about it and not reading it directly.
Yes.
Have you read it? Did you read it?
I had to, unfortunately, and it's not an awesome read. I don't recommend it for any of your listeners. And that's when I tried to focus less on the content of this scroll, of this manuscript, and more about all the people, all of the incredible events, the ups and downs that it kind of triggered and kind of touched upon.
I couldn't tell from the book whether or not you'd actually read it because you don't quote from it. You talk about like in broad strokes what happens, but nothing too specific, which I thank you for because I'm good with what you said. It was plenty. Did you feel when you read it, did you feel this descent into madness or this struggle for agency that other people described when they read it?
Such a good question. There have been these literary experts who have described some pretty horrible effects of reading this manuscript. I think in general, by the very fact that I was reading it out of remove, I wasn't reading it to translate it or to analyze the text. I was reading it because I needed to for the book. So I think I probably had some level of protection that other people, that those other experts didn't have. Having said that, it was clearly one of the most unpleasant reading experiences that I've ever had. People sometimes equate it to 50 Shades of Grey, but it is not that whatsoever. It's much more similar to the original version of torture porn, like the movie Saw or Hostel, except worse. And it goes on and on and on. So it's like a 10-hour version of one of those movies that you are the only person experiencing it right there with the book.
That's, I think, what I missed from the exhibit is that it didn't focus so much on, like, it was sort of tantalizing in the depravity and not talking about all the really horrific, like it was like sexyifying the torture bits instead of actually showing them for what they were describing.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a tendency of the Marquis de Sade and all of his writing, including this. And it's one of the fascinating aspects that I got to explore in the book, where that, most people don't go and read this entire manuscript and read much of Sade's work. So they end up, it almost becomes this kind of talisman that therefore they can ascribe all these other kind of concepts to. And depending on who owned it over the years, the very essence of this manuscript shifted radically. An early sex researcher in Berlin in the early 20th century believed this was actually a manual of sexual diversity. Then it was acquired by the main patrons of the Surrealist movement in Paris, and they saw it as an icon of the avant-garde. So, I mean, it really is, it was this, it did adopt these kind of various kind of concepts over the years.
That's what's so fascinating to me. And I think my original introduction to it was in the same way. I studied theater in school. So my first interaction with the Marquis de Sade was Marat Sade, the play. And then I saw Quills. And so I had much more of a sterilized version of what the actual manuscript is. And then I read more about what it is. And now I'm fine with not reading more.
Yeah, that's a good call.
So where did you say it a little bit in the acknowledgments, but can you talk about where the idea for this book actually came from?
So as I said at the beginning, as a journalist, I'm always looking for good stories. It's what drives me, just finding narratives that I feel like that I can immerse myself in, and then hopefully readers can immerse themselves in. And I stumbled upon an example of this in early 2015. I had some friends who had just come back from Paris on a trip. And like you, they had gone to visit this Museum of Letters and Manuscripts to see this notorious scroll by the Marquis de Sade. And they explained to me that when they showed up at this museum's door, the place was boarded up and police officers were carting materials out the front door. And according to one of the officers, the man who owned the museum, who'd been responsible for his manuscripts, had just been accused of being the Bernie Madoff of France. And so that's all my friends told me, but that was enough to really kind of catch my interest. And I ended up pursuing it for quite some time.
That's so interesting. Had he been on your radar at all before that, the Marquis de Sade?
Just in similar ways that he was for you. I'd seen Quills. I was aware of his work. I hadn't read any of Sade's writing up to that time. It is interesting how, at least here in Colorado, over the past few years, I've been doing these informal surveys, and I'm struck by how many people have never heard of the Marquis de Sade here in the United States. And maybe that's because in some ways he hasn't been captured in pop culture over the past couple decades as he was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, that's true. That's interesting. There's a question that comes up over and over in your book about the Marquis de Sade, and I would love to know what you think, especially after having read some of his work. Do you think he was a revolutionary or a radical philosopher or a proto-feminist or this unrepentant criminal?
I don't think he's, having done a lot of research, having read a lot of his work, having read the majority of his letters, which I think are really telling, my conclusion is that he doesn't end up being or fitting in any of those categories specifically. He clearly was not a true revolutionary, even though he did pretend to be one during the French Revolution in order to save his own aristocratic neck. Though he ended up having concerns in part of the horrible violence of the Reign of Terror, which is kind of ironic coming from Sade. At the same time, while he had philosophical opinions about how things should be done, it was all to benefit his own need and his own ego. He was not there to try to kind of change the world, to make it a better place or shift perspectives. It was all about satisfying his own needs. And he was clearly a criminal. He clearly did horrible things to women, to young men and young women. Now, was he fully unrepentant? Largely so, because even at the very end of his life, he said, look, I'm not going to change who I am. This is who I am. You can't change me. Even though multiple people had tried to execute him, he spent most of his life in prison, breaking out of prisons, but he said, look, I can't change. At times in his letters, both as a young man and later in life, there did seem to be some awareness of how his behaviors were actually incredibly unsatisfying, how he was never actually kind of satisfied his needs by his incredibly selfish, incredibly self-involved behaviors in view of the world. So in general, I basically see him as this just incredibly kind of pampered and selfish French aristocrat who ended up writing some very unusual kind of pieces of writing. And I'm not saying they are these kind of sterling masterpieces of literature, but by their very nature, by their very extremities, they were quite radical at the time, and they still are today.
It's so interesting. I was going to ask you if you thought that he recognized that what he was doing was wrong in some way, but it sounds like what was wrong for him was just that it wasn't as satisfying as he wanted it to be.
Yes, he was so self-involved, he actually believed that it didn't matter what he did to other people, that it didn't matter if other people got hurt, because he was only focused on himself. So, yeah.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? My second podcast, Don't Miss This, takes you beyond the typical and the obvious with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Listen now to Don't Miss This on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So there are these three central stories that you mentioned. There's the story of the life of the Marquis de Sade. There's the path that the original scroll takes through, different countries even. And then there's this evolution of the field of erotic literature collecting, which sort of turns into this broader letter and manuscript collecting. Which of these stories was the one that attracted you the most when you started, and which one fascinates you most now?
That's such a good question. Probably the one that interested me the most at first was the story of letter and manuscript collecting in France, and how this alleged Ponzi scheme kind of rocked this elite world to its core. That to me was utterly fascinating. The idea of this is the epicenter of antiquarian bookshops worldwide, right there, kind of centered around the Latin Quarter on the left bank. And to me, that seems so fascinating as a way into this world, to get to know some of these booksellers, to understand how they determined a book's worth from 500,000 euros up to €1,000,000, hearing about these feuding antiquarian booksellers, elite book auctions beset by sabotage. That to me was just so fascinating. It's the sort of stuff that I think you'd often read in a novelization of these Paris bookstores, but this stuff was real. And that to me was fascinating. And I enjoyed getting a chance to kind of embed myself in that world to an extent. Now, to answer the second part of your question, every aspect of the world of antiquarian booksellers in France was fascinating, the part of the book that I really, that was by far the most challenging, but ended up to me being the most fascinating, was the story of the scroll. The idea of, that by far was the biggest detective work of the book, where I had to try my best to identify all of the various people who owned this thing since the late 18th century. And this thing, as I said, kind of moved from Paris to Provence to Berlin, back to Paris, then was stolen and smuggled to Geneva. This thing kept moving. And so that was a huge amount of work, especially during COVID lockdowns, when I couldn't travel and when I couldn't get a interlibrary loan. But the end result to me was so rewarding that it allowed me to explore these completely fascinating kind of moments in history, from this mostly lost sexual revolution in Berlin at the turn of the century, to the Surrealist movement in Paris, to the student riots in May 68, to underground Victorian erotica collectors who were sneaking around Victoria, England, kind of obsessing over these pornographic works of literature. So that to me was really rewarding.
It was really amazing to see where it would pop up here and there, and how it ended up influencing pop culture over many different time periods. It was so interesting. And I want to ask you about the research that you did, especially because there are so many of these different rabbit holes you must have ended up going into, because your book takes so many twists. Well, the story takes so many twists and turns. Can you talk about the research you did and some of these interesting rabbit holes you went down?
It was definitely an exercise in picking and choosing which rabbit holes to explore. The first step was figuring out exactly who had the manuscript, who actually owned the manuscript, and then what historical events, what kind of worlds they were involved in, and then building upon that. So then reading the existing literature on the rise of sexology in Germany in the early 20th century, kind of reading the best sources on the Surrealists in Paris in the 1930s, and especially these two art patrons who ended up purchasing the scroll and the various kind of controversial works of art that the scroll ended up inspiring at that time. At the same time, what I did for all aspects of the book is that I wanted these characters to speak for themselves as much as possible. So it was really key that if there were any records of letters, of journal entries, of correspondence, to get access to those. And thankfully, we have a lot of those of the Marquis de Sade, because in the mid-20th century, the current members of the Sade family found these trunks behind a boarded up a kind of wall in a secret room in their chateau filled with his letters. So we could actually let Sade speak for himself. And it's the same with a lot of these other characters in the book, where I said, okay, there's been a lot of different interpretations of surrealism, lots of different interpretations of the May 68 riots. Well, let's let these characters speak for themselves. Let's go find news articles. Let's go back to the primary sources and just put the information out there and let readers judge for themselves, as opposed to trying to kind of define and analyze all of these aspects.
Those connections were so interesting. Living here, you learn a bit about all of these different things. So I know about May 68 and I know about the Surrealists and all that, but to make these connections and to see how potentially this text influenced those those different movements is really fascinating. And there were other tangents that I loved, not tangents, but these other stories that you tell, like the one about the hot air balloons, which was so amazing. And even the story about when divorce became legal for like 12 years or some short period of time. And there were like 12,000 divorces, mostly led by women. It's so interesting.
I have to credit one of my former newspaper editors for this sort of thing, because what she taught us was to always ask the question, what is up with that? Don't take anything for granted. If something seems a bit weird, if you have a question about something, pursue it. And that's how I was able to thankfully uncover all of these fascinating aspects. You mentioned divorce law. That was because basically kind of halfway through his life, Sade's long-suffering wife finally got sick of him and said, look, like, we're done. And they got separated. In most biographies of Sade just kind of note they got separated. But I started wondering, well, wait, like, how could they get separated? Like what was the law at the time? And thankfully, we have these incredible scholars who've done work, and you can find these incredible journal articles about history of divorce law in France and how it was basically impossible up until the French Revolution. And then all of a sudden, like, anybody could get divorced. And surprise, surprise, there was this huge boom in divorces, most of which, of course, were instigated by the wives, which is to be expected. French aristocratic males, but good on them.
Yeah, they weren't necessarily known for putting their women on pedestals, as it were.
No, they were not.
Or monogamy or any of that.
Exactly.
I found his wife so fascinating too, because, she goes through her own weird little evolution where she's very devoted to him and she explains a lot of his activities. And I think at some point she maybe takes part in them. Is that true?
Yes, I think it was less I don't think she was ever a passionate supporter of the activities. I think she probably did get kind of caught up in all the drama. She, by all accounts, was a very weak-willed individual, really was unable to put a stop to Sade's horrible behaviors, even as it kind of ruined their reputation, basically sucked their fortune dry. And she watched all these people get incredibly hurt by his behaviors, including herself. And she's, one of these, in some ways, an illustration of how little power women had at the time. And though honestly, it's still a reflection of these abusive relationships today. And so I do not ascribe any blame to her. These were crimes and misbehaviors that were fully instigated, and we should fully assign blame to the Marquis de Sade.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems he must have been very charming and manipulative because he had all these people, these women supporting him, where at the same point he's like degrading them and abusing them and children and all of that. My thought of him would have been that he was just this like dark, negative character and everybody could see that. But it seems like it was, in fact, the opposite. He was quite charming.
Oh, yes. When he was a young man, he was supposedly incredibly striking looking. Women on the street would know to stop and stare. And there was, I think we all know individuals like this, there was something attractive about his neediness, right? This was someone, I think women kind of felt the need to mother him because, he had this real kind of sensitive side, for lack of a better word. And I think he probably kind of employed that as part of his schemes to get whatever his heart desired.
I hadn't thought about that, but that does make sense. So when we think about this original source material, the 120 Days of Sodom, with all of the depravity in it and all of the different things that have happened to this text, it's been hidden, it's been revered, it's been stolen and smuggled and forgotten. It's had abridged versions and warnings attached to it. Some people hail it as this work of genius and other as this work of pure evil. What is your opinion of the text, and how do you think we should approach it, if we should at all?
I view the text as a long, not particularly well-written, highly repetitive exercise in shock and awe. This, I do not believe this was the work of a philosopher who was predicting, at least metaphorically, the rise of the gas chambers and the nuclear bombs of the 20th century, as some people say. I do not see this as someone who was trying to revolutionize a literature. I think this was someone who had spent, by this point, years upon years in prison, and he clearly had some mental problems. And so He embarked on this incredibly kind of tedious exercise to write the worst thing he could possibly imagine. It's almost like as kids seek negative attention. Now, having said that, because this thing literally describes every sort of torture, every sort of violence you could imagine. It's almost cartoonish, the stuff that occurs to this group of people who the main characters are these four kind of depraved aristocrats kind of subject these people to these horrible tortures. And it's, it becomes almost like something out of a Looney Tunes cartoon because it becomes so ridiculous and so obscene and yet also so violent. Even though I don't think that he necessarily had this kind of lofty ulterior motive, I think by its very nature, it is a fascinating work. It is so extreme. I think it forces us to realize, and sometimes we assume that we here in 2023 have been exposed to everything imaginable thanks to the internet, that we're so much less jaded than past generations. And what this work does illustrate is like, no, the human mind has always been capable of conceiving of these incredibly horrendous activities. The human mind, that these things have been put down on paper, have been put down on canvas. And we as a people have always kind of struggled with kind of boundaries in terms of violence and sexual desires and obscenity and all this stuff.
Yeah, and personal pleasure versus, other people's autonomy.
Yes.
Yeah. So the last part of the book focuses more on l'héritier and this Ponzi scheme. And I'm curious to know what you think. I feel like there's a lot that the Marquis de Sade and l'héritier have in common, especially with regards to their levels of narcissism and self-awareness. What do you think that the Marquis de Sade would have thought of l'héritier?
That's such a good insight, Jennifer. These two were similar in many ways, incredibly selfish, incredibly obsessed with satisfying their own needs, whether it was for sexual satisfaction, whether it was for money in both of their cases, whether it was for social standing, especially for l'héritier and his creation of this alleged Ponzi scheme, and also their apparent disregard for anyone they were going to harm along the way. This incredible lack of self-awareness of how their behaviors were ruining not just the lives of all these other people around them, but ended up kind of dooming themselves because they had no awareness that, that they could stop these behaviors, that these behaviors in the long run would not benefit them. Now, to your question about what the Marquis de Sade would think of l'héritier today, probably because l'héritier is not the Marquis de Sade. Marquis de Sade would probably write him off as another annoying aristocrat without seeing his own reflection in this not very kind individual. Once again, lack of self-awareness. So Sade would probably just kind of write him off as one more kind of corrupt aristocrat or wannabe aristocrat, which in his eyes was probably worse, without taking a second to think, oh, well, maybe this guy has something in common with me as normal people would.
Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? Well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. Well, I think it would be really nice to hear a little bit from the book now.
Sure. I'm going to read from the prologue, and I'm going to try to keep the language as non-scandalous as possible.
Thank you.
As you know, there are 3 different storylines. And so I begin the book with, to me, kind of the central character, which is the manuscript itself, which is the scroll. So I begin with the creation of the scroll. The prologue. The Prisoner in the Tower. October 22nd, 1789. As the setting sun slipped below the tiled roofs of late 18th century Paris, a solitary convict leaned over his desk in the Liberty Tower of the Bastille and began to write. The man's fine-tipped quill moved quickly across the narrow sheet of paper, filling the page with delicate, almost microscopically small letters. The lines of brown ink crammed so close together to save space that the descenders of his J's, P's, and Y's stabbed like lancets into the line below. As he wrote, the light from his shaded candles flickered about the whitewashed stone walls of his cramped octagonal cell. The air rank from the waste that poured from the sewer pipe under his window into the moat below. Past his cell door, the prison echoed with the creaks of doors, clattering keys, and bolts slamming into place, the only signs he wasn't completely alone. In the cold evening, shadows played across the trappings allowed to a prisoner of his aristocratic stature, shelves sagging with 600 books, with titles by Homer, Newton, and Shakespeare, as well as works on the existence of God, the motion of fluids, and the history of vampires. Expensive bottles of eau de cologne, fine linen towels, velvet cushions, and colorful tapestries stretched across the walls, and a prized collection of sexual devices, fashioned from rosewood and ebony, crafted to exacting specifications by a prominent Parisian cabinetmaker. The cell's occupant was one of the most notorious criminals in 18th century France. He had spent the bulk of his 45 years reveling in depravity, engaging in blasphemous acts with a prostitute, torturing a beggar, poisoning whores, hiding in Italy in the romantic company of a sister-in-law, locking away girls and boys in his chateau for his own sexual devices, and narrowly surviving a bullet fired at his chest. For years he had evaded the law, breaking out of an Alpine prison, dodging a military raid on his home, absconding from the clutches of a police squadron, and eluding his own public execution. His name was Adon-Etienne Alphonse François de Sade, but most people knew him as the Marquis de Sade. Sade's exploits had come to an end with his capture in 1778. He had first been assigned to the Château de Vincennes, a royal residence turned prison and a hunting preserve outside Paris, where he had briefly been interned as a much younger man. For 6 years he had lived in the damp and rodent-infested cell, whose narrow windows provided only the faintest hint of daylight. Then, in 1784, authorities had shut down Vincennes and transferred him to an even more dismal facility, the Bastille. Located near the heart of Paris, the Bastille was one of the most notorious prisons in all of Europe. With his arrest warrant signed by the king, Sade had been locked away with no charges, no trial, no possibility of appeal. For all he knew, he might never be released. Sade had developed one obsession that eclipsed all his others, a need to put quill to paper. "It is impossible for me to turn my back on my muse," he wrote in a letter. "It sweeps me along, forces me to write, despite myself, and no matter what people may try to do to stop me, there is no way they will ever succeed." He composed endless letters, essays, plays, and novellas, launching a literary career whose reputation would linger long after he was gone, resulting in a body of work so violent and obscene that his author would be variously described as the freest spirit who ever lived, an apostle of assassins, and a professor emeritus of crime. Thanks to his writing, Sade would be so deeply associated with cruelty and perversion that his name would become synonymous the world over with deriving pleasure from pain. But nothing would match the vulgarity of the effort he began this October evening. Experts would come to call the results one of the most important novels ever written, and the Gospel of Evil. The work was titled 120 Days of Sodom, or The School of Libertinage. The very act of reading the story from end to end seems to exact a physical toll. In 1957, the French philosopher Georges Bataille declared, "Nobody, unless he is totally deaf to it, can finish 120 Days of Sodom without feeling sick." The Sade publisher Jean-Jacques Prouvaire admitted that his and his colleagues' work on the novel made us profoundly uneasy for several weeks, the atmosphere broken by outbursts of unexpected, truly crazed laughter. Austen Winehouse, the American author who first translated the book into English in the 1960s, wrote, "Sometimes it happens that reading becomes something else, something excessive and grave. It sometimes happens that a book reads its readers through." And most recently, the British professor Will McMorran began work on an updated English version, only to note on his blog that translating felt like a struggle for agency. Sometimes it felt like I was acting on the text. Sometimes it felt like the text was acting on me. McMorran would come away from the experience believing that 120 Days of Sodom was the worst thing ever written. The novel's onslaught of violence and debauchery made its very existence a mystery. Why would someone have written something so appalling that it was all but unreadable? Why would anyone have bothered with such a Herculean effort at a time when the results could never be published? Who exactly was the man behind it? Was Sade revolutionary, working to expose the rotten core of the aristocracy to which he was born? Was he a radical philosopher, aiming to lay bare humanity's most cruel and twisted desires? Or was he simply an unrepentant criminal, chronicling his own atrocities, committed or simply dreamed of? There is also the puzzle of the manuscript itself. Sade worked on the text from 7 to 10 o'clock each evening, since its content was far too scandalous for him to be caught composing it during the day. When he reached the end of a sheet of paper, he pasted another below it, creating an ever-lengthening scroll. After 22 nights, he flipped the document over and continued to write. The result, after 37 days of work, was a scroll formed from 33 sheets of paper fastened end to end, measuring just 4 inches wide and stretching nearly 40 feet. Both sides were covered with words, 157,000 in total, the text so tiny it was nearly illegible without a magnifying glass. In the years to come, the scroll would embark on a century-spanning odyssey that would take it across Europe. It would endure revolutions and world wars, land in the epicenter of scientific, artistic, and literary upheavals, and become the focus of an audacious heist in international court battles. As the board witnessed hundreds of years of tumultuous history, the fragile text would move from one extraordinary owner to the next, and manage to outlast them all. Finally, in 2014, one of the most powerful men in France would purchase 120 Days of Sodom for €7 million. The price made it among the most valuable manuscripts in the world, comparable to original copies of the Gutenberg Bible, the Canterbury Tales, and Shakespeare's First Folio. The scroll settled into its new home just in time for a year-long national celebration of the bicentennial of Sade's death. The final step of a mass reevaluation of the once banned writer led some French intelligentsia to declare that Sade was France's version of Shakespeare. But within a few months of his homecoming, the manuscript would be snatched away again, this time by French authorities. The ensuing scandal would bring to light festering vendettas at the highest levels of the French government, multi-million-euro manuscript sales derailed by sabotage, and shady financial deals in the shadow of Monaco's Monte Carlo casino. The affair would involve feuding antiquarian booksellers and auction houses beset by theft, and it would culminate allegations of a decade-long, continent-spanning billion-euro con, the specifics of which, if true, would make it one of the biggest financial crimes in French history. The fallout would rock the world's most celebrated book and manuscript market to its core, raising a question with far-reaching implications for everyone who cherishes the written word. As the age of handwriting comes to an end, what is the value of the original texts left behind? Some would conclude it wasn't a coincidence that the upheaval began just after the return of 120 Days of Sodom. The development, after all, was only the latest example how nearly everyone who had sought or possessed the scroll over the centuries had seen their fortunes dashed, their prize snatched away. To many observers, the evidence was clear. 120 Days of Sodom, in all its ugliness and infamy, had to be cursed. The manuscript's modern-day reputation would surely have pleased its author. When Sade began 120 Days of Sodom that October evening in 1785, he knew exactly what he was writing. As he noted in the novel's introduction, "The time has come, friendly reader, for you to prepare your heart and mind for the most impure tale ever written since the world began."
Fabulous. Thank you. That's such a strong opening.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's such a fun story. To me, I want this book almost to be like an amusement park ride. Not to say it doesn't touch on some darker stuff, but I just wanted this to be this fun, evocative tale that people could lose themselves in. So that's what I was constantly trying to figure out the whole way. This is not some sort of literary analysis of Sade. This, to me, I wanted this to read like an international kind of caper. That kind of stretches through the centuries.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. It does do that.
Cool. Thank you.
So what's next for you? Are you going to write another book?
Well, currently I'm quite occupied working at a US-based investigative news outlet called The Lever. So I'm the managing editor over there, and that's been taking up all of my time. It's really enjoyable. I get to work with other writers on their craft. So that's kind of my main focus currently. Now, if I have some friends who show up one day and have some other incredible story about some kind of crime or fantastic relic that they stumbled upon on one of their trips to some exotic locale, I will definitely drop everything and jump on another book.
Okay, and I'll keep you in mind in case that ever happens to me. I'll drop that back on your lap.
Yes, please do. Please do.
So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what's going on in your world?
Probably they can go to joelwarner.com. That's where they can find links to purchase the book from the local bookstore, kind of anywhere in the world, actually. So that's probably the best place. And I'm also kind of noting my other activities there as well. So joelwarner.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joel. This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you again to Joel Warner for such a fascinating conversation. You can find Joel on Twitter at Joel M. Warner and on his website at joelwarner.com. Please join me next week for the season finale of Season 5 of Storytime in Paris, when I'll be speaking with lawyer, law professor, and New York Times bestselling author Pam Jenoff about her book, Codename Sapphire. Check back to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. Please remember to rate and review us and also tell a friend. The more people who know about this podcast, the more we'll be able to grow and the more I'll be able to share fabulous books and their authors with you. Join the Storytime Book Club, which welcomes authors who have been featured on the podcast to come talk more in depth about their books. Since we keep the podcast spoiler-free, this is the perfect chance to get all your specific questions answered. Please visit patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio for more information. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and until next week, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.